everybody. Welcome to the R Plus Canine Podcast. I am your host, Connie Moss, and today we are talking about reactivity. It's such a juicy topic, and a lot of you have probably heard of it before. So you may have heard your vet or your trainer or a groomer even talking about reactivity. What is reactivity? It basically, in a simple definition, it means an overreaction to a trigger. So your dog may overreact, barking, lunging, snarling towards a trigger. A trigger could be another dog or strangers, people, skateboards, vacuum cleaners, motorcycles, bicycles. There's so many possible triggers. And basically this means your dog has a huge overreaction. Why does that happen? There are lots of reasons for reactivity. Just a few that I can think of off the top of my head. It's a very common developmental time during adolescence where dogs are particularly sensitive to things in their environment. It could be just a part of their normal development that they are particularly sensitive and they may overreact. As adolescents, dogs have the prefrontal cortex of their brain is not completely developed yet. So impulse control is a big deal for an adolescent dog. It's hard for them. They don't always balance that out very well and tend to overreact, especially if they're going through a sensitive period. Now, every dog's going to be different. Some dogs will sail through adolescence without a big deal, others not so much. Your dog could be sick. It could have something seriously wrong with it that has caused reactivity. Something like maybe cancer, maybe your dog doesn't feel well. That can really spark off reactivity. Pain can spark reactivity as well. There could be a number of other reasons for reactivity in dogs. Those are just really the top ones that I can think of. One more that ranks up there pretty high is a bad experience. If your dog has had a bad experience, sometimes it only needs to be one bad experience. If it was bad enough for your dog, it can make them become reactive. And what to you may not be a big deal, for your dog, it could have been a really big deal. And that is another way that reactivity can begin. But what I can tell you is that you want to deal with reactivity when you have it in your dog, and the sooner the better. Even if it's normal development, such as an adolescent, or if your dog's genetic traits are to be particularly reactive or protective, you want to deal with it immediately, because the more the dog practices the wrong behaviors, the stronger those behaviors will become. And it will take longer to fix them. It'll be more of an effort to fix it. And that's just a really common sense approach to reactivity training. Fix it really early while it's still easy to fix. So we talked about what it is and why it happens. How do we fix it? Well, it's a two-pronged approach. Management is probably the single most important part of reactivity training. I argue that it's even more important than the reactivity training itself. So management basically means you just prevent the dog from practicing the behavior. As I mentioned, the more the dog practices the behavior, the stronger it will get. So you want to really make sure that when you're out walking your dog, if you typically have reactivity issues out on a walk, you want to walk where you won't run into other dogs, or where you're least likely to run into them, or a time of day when you're least likely to run into them. And you want to be prepared. You want to be able to do U-turns and get away from the situation before your dog sees them. Or you want to be able to block your dog using maybe a parked car or garbage cans, or going around a corner of a building to get away from the visual of another dog, if that is your dog's trigger. So management is the most important. I can't even stress to you how important that is, because you can do all the training in the world to fix this, but if you're allowing your dog between training sessions to blow up and be reactive, the training will never work. It will just never happen. It's like pushing a massive boulder up a hill. You just won't make any progress. So management is the key to fixing reactivity. Once you have the management in place, you can then fix it. You can live your whole life as in management if that's what you want to do. That's fine, not a problem. We always have this saying as dog trainers, we're human, and if you live in a life of management, sooner or later, it's going to fail because you're human and you're controlling the management, and humans make mistakes. It will happen, and just be prepared for that. But there's nothing wrong with living your life in management if that's the best way for you to deal with it with your dog. Maybe down the road you'll be able to do the training, but if not, it's fine. Live with management. If you can do it and you're both happy, it's great. So just touching on the training that we do for reactivity, it's generally the most common approach is counter conditioning and desensitization. So basically in counter conditioning, we're going to expose the dog to the trigger. Let's say we're talking about a dog who is reactive towards other dogs. So I'm going to expose that dog to the trigger. I'm going to let him look at another dog, but I'm going to do it at a pretty good distance, a distance where the dog that I'm working with notices the trigger but doesn't react, or at least doesn't have that reaction that he typically does. And that's the point where I work with the dog and I pair it with something positive. So usually that's food. If the dog is not big into food, I might pair it with toys. That's a whole other subject. You can absolutely do the training with toys, but you have to be a lot more careful about how you do it. So in counter conditioning, we're basically pairing the trigger with positive things. Over time, we will close that distance until we get to a point where we can walk past the trigger at a close proximity. That's going to be different for different dogs. Some dogs can go within a few feet of their trigger. Some dogs have to always be at about 5 to 10 feet from a trigger. It just depends on the dog. And there is a lot at play there, genetics being one of the big ones. So we will do the training until we can get them to that point. So along the way, when you're counter conditioning, you're desensitizing the dog too. The dog is constantly being exposed to their trigger, and nothing bad is happening when they're exposed to the trigger. So that is how we, in a nutshell, do the training for reactivity, at least the most common process for working with reactivity. So we talked about the dog, which is obviously the biggest factor in here. But when we're doing reactivity training, we're also working with you, the owner. You are just as important because you are the leader between you and your dog. You are the leadership role. So it's your job to make sure that your dog is exposed correctly, whether you're going through management or training or whether you finished all that, you have fixed the issue, but you're still always going to have some degree of awareness of when you're exposing your dogs to their trigger. So perhaps maybe you have a day, let's say you have a bunch of family over, it's Christmas, and your dog is not used to a lot of people in the house, so your dog's going to be feeling a lot of stress, and you take your dog out for a walk. Well, that dog is a little stressed already, and going for the walk is certainly helpful for the dog, but maybe in that situation, as a leader, you're going to choose to keep a little more distance from the triggers. So if that's another dog, as we've been talking about in our example, I might stay on the other side of the road or cross the road if I'm about to pass a dog. Or I might step up into somebody's front yard and give some more space so that we can get past another dog. Or if we're out somewhere on a trail, I might step up off the trail. So I would basically create a little bit of distance so that my dog just doesn't have to go through the pressure or the additional stress of passing the trigger. And yes, we fixed it. There's minimal stress involved, but when my dog is having a tough day, I'm not pushing. There's just no reason for it. So we're working with you, the owner, as well. Understand when your dog is over-aroused or when your dog is a little stressed or had a tough day, and how you're going to expose your dog to their triggers based on how your dog's feeling that day. It's always going to be different. And in the end, there is always probably going to be a certain degree of management. I know in this day and age, we always like to think you can fix stuff, make the dog a little robot, and then they should be able to walk everywhere, anywhere, and never, ever have a reaction ever again to their triggers. They should be able to walk right up to the trigger can come right up to them, and the dog should be happy and allow it. And I know that we see it all the time in social media. Some trainers talk about that like that's the goal. But honestly, for me, I see you as a team with your dog. And I'll be honest, I don't want to turn out a machine. I don't want to train the dog to the point where they're just a machine, just going through life without feelings or without any kind of thought about their triggers anymore. I know they're going to have feelings about their triggers. I just learned to identify them. I learned to identify how my dog might be feeling and know that I can get past my triggers because I've had the training and I've done the management, but I'm also going to be thoughtful about my dog. It's still another species that I'm living with, and it's going to have its own set of thoughts or reactions. And while I'm never going to make that dog a robot, I'm going to expect my dog to be able to handle their triggers sometimes, but I'm also going to be thoughtful about it. I guess that's a long-winded way to say I am still very much a part of the team, and I am paying attention to my dog. And if I train with you, if I help you with your dog, I'm going to ask you to do the same. I think it's important. I mean, after all, we are a team with our dogs. We have this other species living in our house with us. I mean, have you ever thought about that? That's just crazy. It's just this other creature living with you and getting along with you day to day, living in a human world, in a world that doesn't really make sense for them. So a little bit of food for thought about reactivity, and when you get on the backside of the training, how you still need to be aware of your dog and their triggers. I hope you find this helpful, and I hope you get out there and enjoy your dogs. Happy training!